and I'm working with a few companies. The reason I start at the individual level is not because I think each individual, especially in a company with thousands of people, that each individual can bring his or her particular taste to the fore. Maybe in their own office, but not much further than that. The reason I start at the individual level is that I firmly believe that if people don't powerfully connect with their own tastes, they can't begin to understand what it means in the corporate context. They can't begin to empathize with others who are coming at it. And it's about reestablishing, not just for creative purposes, but for emotional purposes, reestablishing the awareness of just how powerful honest expression is. And so the idea when you get to the corporate level or the systemic is we have to agree, what does it mean in the context of this company and how can I further it? That's what I call aesthetic empathy. So I'll give you an example. Walt Disney, he's been dead for well over half a century, but his particular view of what defines family fun and how to create an immersive experience around all his characters or his descendants of the company's characters, I'd say as prevalent today as when he was alive.
Hmm.
And it's very different than, for example, Lego, which does a great job aesthetically, but Lego has its own very distinct point of view of how kids like to play and construct things. They each start with a philosophy. The philosophy is not just expressed through aesthetics, but it is largely expressed through how they make what they make and how they communicate everything around what they're making. And if you go to work for one of those two companies, whatever your home style looks like, you are buying into a culture that emanates from that philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to understand it. So some of the exercises I do on the individual level, then when I take that same group of individuals to the corporate level, we go into the archives of the corporate brand. What were the influences that shaped, for example, Walt's view? Having come of age as an illustrator in the 1930s and 40s, first generation, moving pictures and cartoons. My point being, and I could say the same with Steve Jobs, he was very influenced by an aesthetic I'll call mid-century California modern. And if you look at houses in suburban California where he grew up in the 60s and 70s, there was a particular approach to architecture. A lot of glass, a lot of sort of built into nature, sort of Zen-like color palettes, not much of a demarcation between inside and out. I mean, a lot of the way he came into this world and was influenced is a similar thought process that went into making his products and brand. Again, even if you work for Apple today and you didn't grow up in a mid-century modern home as Steve Jobs did, you still have to understand the factors and the forces that shaped it and how it expresses itself in order to be effective. And that to me is a more tangible way to capture culture. Because when I hear people talk about corporate culture, I know they're right, but I wouldn't know, other than sort of some amorphous words, how to really, like, what do I look for? Let's say I'm interviewing for a job and they say, well, make sure it's a good cultural fit. Well, what do I look for? It's a feeling. It's so amorphous. But if I look at aesthetics, how is the reception area set up? What was the style of people working in that office like? Look at the brand codes and the identity of the company. And how does that sit with me? That I can get my arms around.
Yeah.
And so I think in an ideal world, the two are not distinct. One plays off the other, but the aesthetic elements are much more tangible and concrete and identifiable than are the cultural ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, a lot of aspects of your book reminded me of another book I recently read by Will Guidara, Unreasonable Hospitality. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Will Guidara was I don't think he's still the owner of 11 Madison, considered the best restaurant in the world. And his claim was that what got them to this position of being considered the best restaurant in the world was a dedication to hospitality and going really above and beyond. And it was, the examples he gives are things like, you've got some customers who've been to every gourmet restaurant in New York City, and they're chatting among themselves and saying, "Gosh, the only thing we didn't get is a dirty water hot dog, like, from a hot dog vendor." And so he hears that and runs out into the street, gets one of those hot dogs. They do some gourmet stuff to it, and then they surprise their guests with this thing, and they didn't have to do that, but it's going out of the way and doing things that are really above and beyond. And I've been recently, like, trying to understand, what is the beauty of hospitality, and I was in Italy a couple of weeks ago speaking with folks from an organization called Cometa, and it's a network of foster families. They have a lot of foster kids, and they built a school for kids who are high school dropouts, and they have this real commitment to hospitality, which they define as recognizing and communicating to the other the value that they have for you. So to communicate to somebody, you are immensely valuable to me, right? And
Mhm.
and so when you think of finding a great gift for somebody, typically that's what you want to be able to communicate, right? And I notice a lot of what you were talking about in terms of connection, particularly the ways in which companies can leverage aesthetic intelligence in relation to their customers, but perhaps even in relation to their employees, seems to have to do with hospitality in some way. I don't know if
Mm.
you could comment on that.
Well, yeah, there's a few thoughts I have. One is the word hospitality. Again, I'm a wordsmith. Comes
Mhm.
from the Latin hospice,
Yeah.
which actually is related to visitor, or it can be used either as host or visitor. But it came about because at that time, when a stranger came to town, it was treating a stranger with sort of kindness and grace. I know that because number one, I've been struck by how little hospice we see in
Yeah,
hospitals,
they're the
because there are
ugliest
so many
places.
for it.
Yeah.
The sort of grace and kindness and comfort that is
Mm.
so embedded in the idea of great hospitality. But number two, in companies, you're selling to strangers. And I write a lot about the importance to build meaningful relationships. A cynic could call me out on that and say, what does it mean to build a relationship with someone you really have no relationship with? They walked into your store or they even bought something from you online. You don't even know what they look like. And I guess I'm not taking relationship literally. I'm giving people the essence of a relationship, which is what we pine for, especially in this day and age where we have such little real human connection. So I do think businesses that are here to stay will continue to double down on that grace and comfort and empathy that I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
It goes without saying if you have a high-end restaurant like 11 Madison, you better get this right. Because
Mhm.
if not, there's no reason anyone would ever come back. Maybe they wouldn't even go for the first time. If I'm selling tires, an auto shop, you could argue that if I have the cheapest tires or I'm closer to, the hub of business than someone else, they'll come whether I'm nice to them or not. You could argue that. But I would argue that even if you're selling tires, that eventually, if all you're selling is the lowest cost, most convenient, someone else will come and they'll sell it the same price, same location with kindness, and they'll win your market.
Mm.
So to me, it seems that no business is off the hook as long as humans are involved, which is most businesses.
So how would you sort of measure higher versus lower aesthetic intelligence? Because there's so many components, it seems, right? There's the attentiveness to various senses, and then there's also the connection, relational elements. When you advise businesses, when you advise individuals, what is the kind of metric of higher and lower aesthetic intelligence at work
Yeah.
there?
So I've broken it down into four subcomponents, and each of them have different exercises and different capabilities in order to strengthen them. A little bit like if you're a great athlete, it's one thing to be limber, it's another thing to be able to have great aerobic capacity. And in an ideal world, you have some combination of all of those assets working together. So the first, which is what I alluded to earlier, is what I'll call aesthetic sensitivity. It's attunement. It's just the watchfulness. In fact, I was being interviewed by a Russian publication, and they said there's a word. I wish I remembered what it was in Russian, but it translates as watchfulness that they use a lot. And it starts with this sort of heightened awareness of your surroundings and of your stimulus. But you don't want to stop there.
Mm.
Because if you stop there, I mean, you could argue that many people who are on the autistic spectrum have a much higher awareness for sound and for tactility. And if you don't know what to do with it, it becomes overwhelming, which is also why a lot of people on the autistic spectrum have a very hard time focusing because they're so distractible. That's just the first step. It's not the last step. The second one is what I call it interpretation, but it really is about being able to decode not just what I'm feeling, but how I'm feeling about it. And it's sort of a power of discrimination. Let's just go stick with the restaurant analogy. If I'm having a meal and I enjoy it, but I feel like maybe the beverage that I'm drinking doesn't really blend well with the food that I ordered, or the food is good, but maybe if it were a little, the dessert were a little less sweet, it would feel even more tempting or delicious. So the ability to sort of deconstruct the elements, and that's more of an analytic element, but it's also interpretive. The third step is what I'll call curation or editorial command. One of the exercises I do with students is I have them create mood boards. And oftentimes the first step you do with a mood board is you'll take, let's say you have a particular project and you want sources of inspiration, and they just take pictures, swatches, and things that they like, and they just put it on the board. And that is a good way to start, but it is just a start.
Mm,
Good curation is not having everything you like come together, but it's knowing what to take off and how to
mm,
elevate parts of it, how to sort of create a narrative around the individual elements that works congruently and uniquely well, right? So that's sort of a curative exercise. And then the last one is what I call articulation. Given that most people are not working as individual contributors, they have environments, they might have clients, they certainly have team members. It's really important, both verbally and non-verbally, to be able to convey with precision and specificity what you're trying to go toward aesthetically so that other people can collaborate. I find even at the MBA level, they're good communicators when it comes to diagnosing problems. They're not good communicators when it comes to telling a story that others would know, even if they were not privy to all the information or thought processes that you had, that others would be able to envision what you envision and how to go there. So this idea of articulation is a very important part, particularly in business.
what's a good example of articulation that stands out to you, like a company that's done that well, or a person that's done that well?
I mean, I think if I look back, it's past its prime. But I think what Howard Schultz did with Starbucks to take one of the most commoditized objects, which is a coffee bean, and bring people toward it, even if it was less convenient than their corner coffee shop, charge 2 or 3x, and to do so through not just creating an environment that they used to call the third space that had, a lot of Starbucks codes. You really can never go in and forget you're in a Starbucks.
Yeah.
But even the naming of a barrister, he's not
Mhm.
just the guy behind the counter. The naming of the size of the cups, a grande, it's not
Right.
just a large, medium. They took anything that might have been a commoditized approach to what they were selling, and they owned it as their own. And they still are. They're constantly coming out with new products, which are just basically new combinations of the same old stuff with maybe some more food coloring. But
Right.
in the end, that doesn't matter. What matters is how they tell the story. And again, in ways that created something that for a good while felt like a unique space for buying a commodity product of,
Yeah.
coffee beans.
Right, 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 right. I mean, this raises interesting questions about ethics, which you talk about in the book, right? I mean, if you could say a little bit more about the aesthetics, or the ethics of aesthetic intelligence, and yeah, the ways in which aesthetic experiences and the ways in which aesthetic factors are communicated can be deceptive, manipulative. How does that feature into this other AI?
First of all, let me say many of the principles I've been talking about have been used very effectively at different points in history as propaganda.
Hmm.
Whether it was the Nazis in the 1930s with their very iconic symbol of the swastika, and that was their aesthetic code. And it is so vilified now that I can't think of too many other symbols where if somebody went out in the street wearing a t shirt with it, that person, not in this country, but in some countries, would be arrested. And in this country as well, would be heavily disliked, maybe despised, just for wearing the t shirt. And so that was a powerful aesthetic movement, which powerful now, horrific, right? And I think it isn't a historical phenomenon. I mean, I think the MAGA movement and the red hat, I mean, the red hat became a code of whether you're a Trumper or an anti Trumper. It's a simple red cap, but it took on a meaning of expression and belief that went well beyond what it actually is. The ethics piece, I can't fault the people who come out with the MAGA hat because that is their code. I personally wouldn't be caught dead wearing one or having anyone I know or affiliate with. But you could argue it represents a belief system that a good portion of the American population is still embracing, where it becomes a real ethical violation, not just an offense, is when it's dishonest, when it's used for purposes of gain, what I'll call ill gain. So I mentioned before the jewel is an example. I feel like a lot of big food companies are guilty of this, where food products are marketed as healthy and organic and good for this and good for that, with no basis in science and with the only objective to get people to consume more so they can grow more, notwithstanding the fact that for them to consume more, the obesity issues, which they may be fighting in their philanthropic arm, are only going in one direction. So I feel like food marketing has been subject to that. I just saw actually an ad, a full page ad in the New York Times last weekend, and it was for Altria, formerly Philip Morris. It has rebranded itself the Tobacco Harm Reduction Company. I don't know if you've
Wow.
seen that.
No.
And the idea is that they still want people to smoke, but they also can no longer run from the claim that this is not harmful. So the only way that they've sort of managed to play in a way that there's some self-respect is okay, but we'll say we're for harm reduction. My point being, any company and every company struggles with this, but every company in this day and age is accountable. And those aesthetic cues often work for a period. The food companies have shown time and again that we will buy things thinking we're healthy, and then we'll realize that actually it has an ingredient that's very unhealthy, and then we'll move to the next fad. It doesn't work in the long term. And I think the only way out of this, and this is not just an aesthetic solution, is I think companies and even political interests have to think longer term. They have to
Mm,
sort of say,
mm.
would I be, with all that I know, am I willing to make that claim with not just the agenda of more voters or more market share, but a genuine belief of why I'm in business and why being in business is providing some sort of good.
Beauty at Work is brought to you by Templeton Religion Trust. If you enjoyed this clip, go check out the full episode. And please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks, and see you next time.